Hello and welcome to BIOS Builders. Today we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Ivan Dimov, co-founder and CEO of Orca Bio, to the show. Ivan, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's kick things off. Ivan, can you share a brief personal introduction with us today?
Sure. My name is Ivan Dimov. I am the co-founder and CEO of Orca Bio. Orca Bio spun out of Irv Weissman's lab. It's in Stanford around 2016, where I used to work as a Siebel Fellow and a visiting instructor. So Irv is one of the folks who pioneered this space by essentially discovering a lot of the biology and the processes that create and maintain our entire blood and immune system, which is really the foundation for some of the things that we're building here at Orca Bio, trying to address some of these terminal patients who are suffering from these deadly diseases. And at Orca Bio, we're trying to build better curative therapies for them. Before Orca Bio, I co-founded Lucira Health, a molecular diagnostics company that received the first FDA authorization for a COVID-19 at-home self-testing device that uses molecular technology for detecting COVID and has since been expanded into other respiratory diseases. So in general, throughout my career, I have been really driven by this sort of intersection of discovery, innovation, and research. What I really strive to do is to find problems that are really important to society, that are very big and hard to solve, try to use the best knowledge and science and creativity that we have to find really interesting discoveries and solutions. But then instead of just publishing those in academic journals, I find that it's really critical to translate those to society. And I found the best way to do that is to create startups, which is really a mechanism, a tool to bring that innovation discovery to impact as many patients and as many lives as possible, really trying to bring a lot of good to the world. And that's always been the thing that's always driven me and motivated me is discovery, innovation, but also translation into society such that everyone can really benefit and not just leave it at a publication where most people stop. So that's a little bit about me.
And as you described, you're trying to provide that impact for patients through startups. So before we dive deep and get into one of them today, can you provide maybe a brief introduction to Orca for us?
Sure. So Orca Bio is a cell therapy company. One of the key differentiators that we have is high precision. In other words, we have built out a set of high precision approaches and technologies to allow us to extract a lot more efficacy and also control toxicities a lot more out of cell therapies. And so we are currently in late stage development as a company and hoping to get our first approvals pretty soon and really go on to launching these medicines for some of the most severe and terminal blood cancers out there.
Wow, a space that I think we're all excited to dive deeper into. So, as you mentioned, in 2016, you helped co-found Orca, spinning out of Stanford with a mission to bring these high-precision allogeneic cell therapies to patients. So maybe before we dive into the science specifically, let's take a step back and instead ask, can you tell us more about the genesis of Orca and what was the spark that really started it all?
That's a great question. So one of the amazing things about Orca is that it happened where there was a clear problem and we were introduced to the problem. In my mind, figuring something out new that's kind of worthy to follow and start, you want to start first with a problem statement. A lot of people end up starting with a really cool technology and then try to find a problem for the technology. Here we did it the other way around, and I think it's just a lot more natural and effective doing it, starting off with the problem. And then we found sort of the technologies and the solutions that would best fit to solving that problem. And the problem was introduced to me by I was at the time at Stanford working with Irv Weissman in Irv Weissman's lab. So Irv Weissman introduced this problem to me. And it was related to a previous company that he had founded maybe 15 or 20 years earlier. So Irv is known for discovering the blood-forming stem cells. He's a physician by training, but he spent most of his life doing research. So he's really a scientist. And he's always been fascinated with understanding, how biology works and how that can impact diseases and how we can solve some of the diseases that we're confronted with. And with the blood-forming stem cells, you sort of are exposed to how the entire blood and immune system is created, and how it's maintained in people, and that interacts with many diseases. And that fundamental discovery led him to create a company called Systemics about 20 years ago. And it was one of those initial pioneering cell therapy companies way before this latest generation of cell therapies came along. And it was very novel and revolutionary for its stage. And specifically, their initial trials were around breast cancer and treating patients who have metastatic breast cancer that spread all over. And usually folks with that stage of disease and that type of disease have a very, very poor prognosis. It's practically a death sentence. And maybe call it 10-ish% probability of long-term survival. And so this company used some of that novel science that Irv had covered to try to find more curative approaches for patients. And they had a really interesting approach, and they tried it on about 40 patients, and it seemed to work really well. The data was coming in very, very impressive. And the company actually got acquired by Sandoz, which became Novartis later on. And I think it was one of the largest ever private company transactions that had happened to that moment, close to $1 billion. And what was interesting about that approach is that it seemed to cure a lot of folks, and it was very promising. However, maybe 2 or 3 years later, after its acquisition, the whole thing was shut down. And it was really sad because about 12 years later, we went back to look at how those patients had done. So those 40 patients that were treated in those initial trials. And those patients, somewhere around 30 to 40% of them were still alive, and you could argue cured at that point. And that was very impressive. That was unprecedented for that type of disease. And it almost felt like we knew how to cure patients that had very severe breast cancer, but we just weren't implementing it, right? And it almost felt unethical, because if you do the numbers of how many people suffer from breast cancer, it's a huge number of folks. And you can sort of even calculate how many you could have cured. And it makes you feel really sad that we're not doing that. And that's really what sparked us to start Orca, because the main issue, well, there's several issues, but one of the key issues of why they couldn't really scale this thing was manufacturing. The tools for manufacturing this approach were not there. And you could kind of kludge something together, run a few trials, but when it came to really building a business that can scale and deploy this en masse, the tools weren't really there, the manufacturing tools. And specifically, one of the key issues was precision, because one of the key fundamentals of how this approach worked was that you knew exactly which cell you had to take and put into the body of the patient to generate the cure. And if you didn't follow the high precision, you would lose the whole point of it. And the precision part was really hard to implement in sort of large scale manufacturing. And that's what led me to think about this alternative of, look, we understand precision is really important in general in all areas of therapeutics, but in cell therapy, it's also very important, and we don't have all the right tools to fix that problem. And yet we know already with some of these experiences that if you're building a brand new therapy from scratch, the biggest problem is, will it work? Is the biology going to work? Is the medicine going to work? And here was a situation where we knew that the biology was viable and that it could work, and we could really save folks. And so the only barrier here is really just the tools to implement it. And that felt like a very inspirational thing, because the risk profile of building tools is much lower than building new therapies. And yet, in this scenario, if these tools were successful, you could have the benefits and the value of essentially creating a new therapy that can save terminally ill people. So that was the genesis of Orca. That's how we got started. That was a spark. The challenge was, could we now develop new set of tools that allow us to scale with high precision the cell therapies that could benefit from this approach?
That's an incredible story and a phenomenal history. So thank you for guiding us through that, Ivan. And to talk about some of those competencies, to talk about some of those tools, I'm going to pass it over to our host, Drew, to dive deeper. Drew?
Thank you so much, Chris. Ivan, it's so amazing to have you on to discuss more about Orca. It's amazing hearing your genesis and really the mission from the start about how Orca started with this mission, has kind of carried on through that manufacturing, through that scale problem. And I really wanted to divert my first question to address that problem directly. Ivan, from your perspective, building off the spark, starting in breast cancer was fascinating. But in the cell therapy space broadly, I wanted to take some time just to ask and provide some context for our audience. Maybe could you just really lay out and share more of the information about the difficulties of developing efficacious cell therapies and kind of today's standards? What are some of the key unmet needs in the space currently?
It's a great question. So it's a very exciting new area of medicine and therapeutics. If you think about it, the cell is that building block of life. And you can do things with cells you can only dream of doing with other forms of medicine. So, for example, if you're trying to use some kind of a small molecule, chemical, or a piece of protein to regenerate parts of your body, it's going to be very, very hard, if not impossible. And so there's a whole slew of diseases that we just can't really start to generate cures for if we use the conventional forms of therapeutics. And so cell therapies is this new frontier. However, it's very exciting, and I think it can solve a lot of intractable problems that exist today in medicine. But at the same time, it comes with lots of complications. So cells are also very sort of volatile and unstable, right? They're usually living entities, so they're a lot more fragile. Over time, they change. So if you think of them as maybe as a raw material that go into a factory that you're going to use then to build a therapy out of, and you compare sort of this living, very dynamic, very complex element versus a small molecule, which is just a regular chemical like salt, it's much more difficult to work with that. There isn't all the infrastructure to provide you with all the elements that you need that exists out there today. You kind of have to build it yourself. Things have changed very rapidly. I think one crazy example is that when you build a cell therapy, like in conventional therapeutics, one of the concepts is that every batch that you manufacture, you want to keep retains of that, so that if anything weird happens with the patients, you can go back to your retains and retest them and use that to investigate what's going on. In cell therapies, those retains, just the act of retaining something, you're already changing its nature, because taking a cell and freezing it down, you're changing its fundamental nature. So if I've given the batch to a patient and something goes wrong and I go back to my retain and I start investigating it, there's lots of questions whether whatever I discover with that investigation is even relevant, because that's not what the patient got. They got the cells before they went through the stress of being frozen and unfrozen again, right? So a lot of those concepts that are built into the fundamental regulatory system that we have are hard to apply, and sometimes they don't even apply in the context of cell therapies. The other big issue is that, or the exciting piece is that it's a lot of times these cell therapies are single dose curative. What that means is, unlike conventional medicines that you have to take over extended periods of time and you're taking many, many doses, here you infuse these elements one time, and if they work properly, they'll cure you for the rest of your life. So that means all these payments get condensed into a single payment, right? So that is very different to the way the current reimbursement systems work. Logistics is also very different because, again, these things are very fragile, so they have to be very quickly from the moment that you maybe get them out of your source until you manufacture them, until you deliver them, and then you infuse them into the patient, that entire chain normally might take months to years, right? And these regular medicines might sit in a warehouse for many, many months. This cannot happen with cell therapies. The whole cycle has to be condensed to hours, right? Or maybe in some case days, but that's kind of it. So a lot of the systems and infrastructures that we have currently for other modalities just don't directly apply. And so it makes it very tough and challenging to work with, because you're not only creating a new therapy and figuring out the science behind it and optimizing it, which is what standard therapeutics kind of development does, but you're also creating all the infrastructure to get you to even be able to do that kind of optimization. So those are some of the big challenges when you're working with cell therapies.
Oh, I mean, massive ones to undertake in the decades to come as this modality is just expanding. But it's amazing to hear from your perspective. And I think Orca is approaching some of these challenges in some pretty unique ways. When we're talking about precision, I mean, your platform itself, I mean, using a proprietary mixture of the natural immune cell stem cells with your really single cell precision a level of creating some of these new therapies has definitely seen some amazing stuff. I love what you all have done, kind of focused in on bone marrow transplantation. But I think kind of just going deeper as we're talking about some of these larger systemic issues, could you really just tell us a bit more about Orca's solution? I mean, how it addresses some of these challenges? I know we talked about the spark that started it all, but as a follow-up question, how did you and the team really arrive at the Orca solution as far as fitting into these larger problems in the ecosystem that cell therapy faces?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we initially started addressing the manufacturing, and specifically the precision problem manufacturing. And then we built some prototypes around that. And we were really impressed with the capability of achieving that. And very quickly, we felt that, if we really want to have maximal impact and as quick as possible with patients, maybe it's best that we use these technologies to build therapies that nobody else could really build. And so we became more of a fully integrated company in a way that, we build our therapies, and our product is really the therapy itself. But in the background, we have all this IP and knowledge of how to build the manufacturing expertise and the manufacturing machinery necessary to achieve these sort of lofty goals of building these high precision therapies that people in the past have not been able to do. And we then looked around and said, well, where can we apply this? Where's the first sort of demonstration that we could apply this best and quickest to? And it turned out that the most well accepted and most widely known cell therapy out there is the bone marrow transplant. It's been around for over 50 years, and it's incredible. It has the same features as any other cell therapy. It's single dose, it's curative, and unfortunately also has a lot of toxicity. And so we looked at that and said, well, this is a great example because it's already widely used. A lot of people are benefiting from it. However, the efficacy is, it's impressive, the fact that you're taking terminally ill blood cancer patients who failed all of the treatments, have no other option, and you're doing a bone marrow transplant on them. And you're actually saving a decent number of those folks. That's incredible. So it just shows you the power of that approach. However, the majority of the patients still relapse or have other issues and pass away. So there's still a lot to be done on the efficacy side. It's far from being ideal and perfect. And the other big scary thing about it is that the medicine itself also kills 20 to 30% of people. In other words, the approach itself is pretty damn toxic. So there's a lot to be done there, even though it's a very powerful and reliable tool. It's the gold standard that we have right now. And the other great thing about it is that we've learned a lot about the science of how it really works. And so when you know how things work, you can pinpoint what is really critical, and their precision has a huge impact. And so we felt this is a place where we can really harness the power of all of our manufacturing technology and really use that to demonstrate significant improvements and significant increases in survival and patient benefit. And so that's why we focused initially as a company in solving all the challenges around bone marrow transplant. And so what we did is we built our own cell therapy that replaces the need for a bone marrow transplant. And essentially what our therapy does is it resets and replaces the person's entire blood and immune system. And so usually you have a patient who has a disease that is usually originates from the blood or immune system, or at least the blood and immune system plays a huge role. And in the case of blood cancer, as the name suggests, it's a cancer right in the blood. So if you can remove that diseased system, that faulty system, and replace and reset it with a brand new one that's healthy, you can technically cure the disease, or you can at least have a huge impact on patient outcomes. And so that's the approach that we took. And with these high precision tools, we essentially built a designer immune system. We sort of programmed in the functions that we wanted of this new healthy immune system that we want to bring into the patients, at least initially, so that it can rapidly seek and destroy any residual cancer from the old blood system, so that it can really rebuild a whole brand new, healthy, fully functioning, fully balanced immune system in its place. And at the same time, while you're going through that transition from having the old system, getting it removed and bringing in the new one, there's a period of time when you're very vulnerable because you don't have any immunity, you don't have an immune system, so you're very vulnerable to any infections and anything from the outside world. So you need that sort of baseline level of immunity to come up as quickly as possible. And at the same time, you want to make sure none of these cells reject you or cause any other toxicities. And so we built, with the high precision tools, this right ideal composition of immune cells, T cells, and stem cells, i.e. a designer immune system that we can then put into the patient and allow the patient to recover, and at the end of this process have a whole new blood and immune system for the rest of their lives. And what's really crazy about it is if you take these patients we treated, and this is not too dissimilar to what happens in an old school bone marrow transplant, but if you take some of these patients and you take a drop of their blood and you measure their DNA, you realize that their DNA in the blood, because these cells usually come from a healthy donor, is the healthy donor's DNA. And is different to their own DNA in the rest of their body. So they're essentially human beings with two genomes, the donor's genomes and their own genome. So it's a very peculiar situation, but it's very effective. It seems to be very effective in curing diseases.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see. I mean, thank you so much, Ivan, for covering some of the areas that you all have been able to tackle within developing. I mean, I love the terminology around designer immune system and what you all been able to create. But I think that also touches on some of the bigger issues around immunity and kind of the current front lines of standard of care. What Orca has really had to go at lengths to ensure this is a therapy that has to be designed, from the beginning as something that needs to be integrated in the clinic. You really touched on this, but in particular, just doing our research, I was really fascinated by, the clinic focused approach that Orca had, from the beginning, promising and really seeking to seamlessly integrate within the current treatment settings, and add no additional complexity to really an already extremely difficult field. I think you already touched briefly on some of the ideas, some of the quarantines you have to have, some of the current frontline issues that you really need to do, even just in the transplants. But I just think, as a step back, Ivan, could you maybe discuss some of the key design choices or even just mindset adjustments you and the team had to make to improve kind of the clinic-centric product focus that you all kind of have at Orca today?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great question. So yeah, no, I guess from day zero, we recognized that we want to build a new solution, a new therapy, a new product to really help patients. And the science and the composition and the mechanism of action are key and fundamental. But almost as important as that is, how does society bring this in, adopt it, and massively deploy it, right? Therefore, if you want to have as quickly as possible that impact, and if you really are focused on the patient and bringing this as quickly as possible to as many patients as possible, then you really want to leverage as much of the existing workflows and infrastructure that's in the system as possible. And rather than trying to make the medical system adapt to you, you should try to adapt as much as possible to the system that's already out there. because this way you're not going to have to change the customs and the ways that people already operate. If you can fit in your process, your therapy into the existing medical workflows, then it can be very rapidly adopted. And from day zero, we try to do that as much as possible. And so there's already some infrastructure built in from the old school bone marrow transplant days that's been around. And we try to leverage that as much as possible because there's lots of good things there. There's lots of historical lessons and lots of optimizations. And we really wanted to build on top of that. And so we try to integrate ourselves seamlessly into all of that. So when it comes to getting that donor material, you can actually use the infrastructure that was built for bone marrow transplants, all these collection centers across the world. And the logistics of moving these cells around has also, done a lot of optimizations there that you can leverage. And then the way that the hospital then receives these cells and deals with the infusions and the patients, again, this also can be leveraged. And so we've tried to do, integrate this in a way that things operate almost as normal as if they were a conventional sort of setting, but instead they get a product with a really nice label on it that generates way better efficacy and eliminates, as much as possible, if not all of the toxicity that you're normally accustomed to see. And ultimately, you just get a lot more survival and a lot better quality of life and curing for the patients.
No, 100%. I mean, it's amazing to see, this from day one mentality bring into the clinic. It's novel how you all have approached that. I really respect it as a company as well. I mean, Ivan, just as a serial founder too, someone that really shaped this mentality for Orca, do you really have advice for future founders on really just the key design choices to kind of get it right at the early stage? Use some of these principles you thought about integrating into the clinic. What really principles or best practices should founders kind of heed even when designing their product development programs? Or do you have kind of advice for those founders when they're kind of developing these pipelines of their own?
Sure. I mean, it's definitely messy. Life is messy, so it's hard to have one sort of piece of advice or one solution that works for all settings. But maybe the lessons that I've personally gone through in experiencing all of this, just like any change, any innovation, it's hard. It's really, really hard. But that's okay. That's normal. And don't be afraid of it. Be extremely persistent. Be stubborn. But the hard part about it is you also have to be very humble and learn from your mistakes and change, which is weird because I'm telling you to be stubborn, and yet I'm telling you not to be stubborn, right? Because I'm telling you to change, I'm telling you not to be stubborn. But sort of that's the hard part is figure out when do you have to be stubborn and just keep going at it, and when is it that you have to sort of take in the data that you're getting, the advice you're getting, the lessons from history. History is really important. There's a reason for everything the way it is in the world, and you have to understand it if you want to ultimately be able to shape it and change it and improve it. And don't be arrogant. Be very humble. Take those lessons and I think be focused on the primary goal, whatever that huge value is. And I think that the key thing is hopefully value is not it's not just about making money. I don't think it should even be about making money. It should be about bringing value to society, and everything else will work itself out at the end. And so focus on the fundamental mission, which is bringing value to society, and then be humble about how you bring that forward and how do you cause that change. Leverage as much as possible the history of everything and the infrastructure and the knowledge that's around you, and then keep constantly optimizing and improving, but be stubborn as hell to push it through. I think those are the key lessons. And unfortunately, there's probably nothing you guys haven't heard before, but it's really, really true. And I think it's true in most fields, and definitely this field as well.
Sure. No, I mean, key lessons to, have regardless. There's always things you need to work on, but it's amazing hearing from you, Ivan. Just while we're on the subject of scale and manufacturing, as you mentioned with Orca as a platform itself, you deal with as much scale issues and manufacturing issues as you do, talking about perfecting your own cell lines therapeutics. I mean, as you're kind of building out the drug itself. I just would be really curious to press down that line on manufacturing and scale. There are a lot of issues, obviously, in cell therapy in the space, with the idea of integrating the clinic. Obviously, the end goal, drug development itself and approval, but kind of the middle ground itself. As you talk about the platform, could you just discuss directly about Orca, some of the issues that you're talking about, how you all are thinking about or how you are currently addressing kind of these problems of scale within cell therapy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so to date, we have treated about, I think we have, several products in the pipeline, and we have several clinical trials ongoing as well. If you add it up, we've treated over 300 patients to date, all terminally ill, and knock on wood, and thankfully so far everyone has been doing extremely well. So overall survival rates have been unprecedented, and it's been amazing to meet some of these people and meet their families. And scale is a big issue. During COVID, just to give you a sense, one of the amazing things about our therapies is that our patients are discharged from the hospital much, much quicker. And it was a surprise to us how quickly people get back to normal life. And this has been such a powerful way to treat patients that even recently, when my co-founder's father-in-law got diagnosed with a very severe form of blood disorder and cancer, really the only option that we felt that was really gave him the best chance at life here was using one of our therapies, and it really being able to impact people as close as family members has been really impressive. But ultimately, what we've seen is that whenever hospitals adopt this approach, they kind of tend to switch over into it because you feel the difference so starkly. And during COVID, that was a big deal because the sooner you can discharge somebody from the hospital, the less time you need that they need to spend in the intensive care unit in the ICU, the better it was, right, for the pandemic. And that was really critical during the pandemic, if you guys remember. And so because of that, a lot of the hospitals started to basically put all these patients that walked in the door onto our clinical trial because there was no way they could access the products except through the clinical trial, which meant there was a huge spike in demand. And we weren't ready for it because we had built a small manufacturing facility, state of the art, but small, because it was meant for small scale testing and clinical trials. It wasn't meant to treat everyone walking in the door. And we had to struggle with that. We had to really squeeze and push as hard as possible. I remember everyone was like sheltering in place, and we were trying to hire people to come into the factory and manufacture more. Thankfully, we were able to quadruple the capacity and kind of meet that urgent demand. But it really brought to light all the stress points that you need to tackle in really scale if you want to impact a lot of folks. And what's interesting, one of the big lessons that I learned is that as much as you can leverage infrastructure that exists out there, when you are building something brand new, something as novel and different as what we're doing, inevitably you will find areas where the infrastructure is just not there. And it's scary because the standard wisdom suggests that if you are, let's say, a drug developer, then you focus on developing drugs. You don't focus on building other pieces. For example, if you need to have a really good logistical link and transportation, you go to FedEx, right? You go to the guys who know about logistics and transportation. That's what standard wisdom suggests. But when we did all those things, at least in the context of our cells and our cell therapies that need to, it's sort of a life or death situation, and hours count and matter. When you use the existing logistical infrastructure or the conventional wisdom infrastructure, you realize it doesn't really fit well, and it doesn't provide the urgency and the value that you need. And so at the end, you're sort of like forced with building your own logistical system. And that's scary because you're saying, well, I'm not an expert in logistics. Like, that's not my core business. Am I making a mistake by building a whole unit that does logistics and building a miniature logistical company within Orca? And like that, there's several examples. Like on the manufacturing side, right? You can outsource manufacturing to somebody else technically, right? There's all these CROs that can do that for you, and they They do it in such grander scale and have so much more experience than you do. But it turns out that our manufacturing is so unique and peculiar, it's not easy to do that. And if you do that, you actually run more risks than just doing it yourself. But you don't know this at the beginning. You think that you are, even though all the data is suggesting you got to do it yourself, because this is so weird and novel that existing knowledge is not very helpful in this particular setting. And if you have to invent something from scratch, you're probably the best entity to do that versus forcing somebody else to invent the solutions for you. It's even though all of that data is suggesting that's the best way to do it, otherwise, in other words, do it yourself. It is a scary proposition, and it's a scary decision to make because you don't want to like burn unnecessary resources and take them away from the core mission. And to me, that's been the biggest lesson is when you're doing something pretty novel, it's okay to go against kind of the conventional advice and bring some of those things in-house, even though they're not part of your core business. It actually becomes part of your core business. And I think the best analogy for me, if you look way back in time, is sort of when you look at the history of, for example, some of the new industries like the car industry, right, 100, 150 years ago, and how Ford did it, right? And when Ford started building his first cars, there wasn't all this knowledge. There wasn't all of this infrastructure out there. He had to build it from scratch himself. And not only did he have to invent the manufacturing line and invent a lot of the machines in the manufacturing line and build the factories, but he also had to build the cities around the factories and the schools for the people who lived in those cities who then went to the factories, right? And he did a lot of stuff that were not in the core mission of Ford, but he needed to build all that surrounding infrastructure to make it a possibility. And that's kind of what we've seen ourselves forced into doing, which again sounds scary because the resources are always limited, and you want to focus them on the core mission rather than some of these side projects, but these side projects become pretty critical pretty quickly. So that's one of the big lessons that we've learned on what is it that you need to do when you have to scale.
I think that's a phenomenal point, especially as you're developing something truly novel, Ivan, that there's more than just the core technology. You have to build the surrounding infrastructure to ensure that technology is readily translated for impact, as you've been saying all along. So you've already started to answer the question about what some of the major challenges Orca has faced, but you've also faced some incredible success since your founding, pioneering a novel development and manufacturing approach within cell therapy, raising over 300 million to date to scale your active clinical programs. So we've talked about some challenges. We'd love to hear, by that same token, what have been some of the greatest accomplishments or milestones that you feel like you've also reached? And you highlighted a few, but I wanted to ask that very open-ended question for you.
Thanks. That's a great question, and I probably will miss because there's so many amazing things that we've been able to do. But I think what comes to mind immediately is just the patients, being able to provide this to so many patients that are in such tough situations when we have the opportunity to help. And then just being able to experience most of the times indirectly through the doctors, but sometimes directly, just a really rapid and unprecedented recovery and going back to their normal lives and so quickly. And we have stories where some patients, were Air Force pilots and within months, they want to be back to flying jets, right? Very stressful kind of a job. And being kind of on the verge of death to going back to flying jets is really incredible. Or like our co-founder's father-in-law, who loves mountain biking and biking in general, and pretty much right after getting out of the hospital, he was back on his bike. In those first 12 months, he did 3,000 miles of cycling. I mean, I don't do that, and I'm not even ill, right? And just seeing somebody go from like, is there a future for me on this planet to being such an incredible person is extremely heartwarming. So to me, that's by far and beyond. If nothing else works out, just having achieved that is worth every penny and more. But ultimately, I think one layer below that is being able to be in this really late stage of development right now. This area, so bone marrow transplants, the thing that we're replacing, has not been FDA approved ever. It's a technique, it's a process. It's not really a product. It's a technique that was taught from doctor to doctor organically, and it was never really regulated by the FDA. And it was sort of grandfathered in. Actually, it existed before the FDA was regulating these kinds of things. So there is no regulatory path here. It's like, so we don't know what we need to do to prove to the FDA that this is better, because we can't follow anybody else's precedent here. So we've had to create our own precedents. And that was a bit of a challenge, but being able to have overcome all of that, have that already clear, have the agreement of the FDA on that, having launched the registrational trial, being very, very advanced in the enrollment there, and being pretty close to, getting that enrollment completed and getting the BLA enabling data or the data ready for an FDA approval, and being the first, hopefully, knock on wood, approval of this kind in this space, and sort of creating a whole new class of therapy, is also extremely gratifying and really a testament to everyone's effort here, and extremely satisfying and humbling, because we feel that that's a critical piece to be able to spread this to even more than just 300 patients, right? Being able to get it to thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of patients across the world. I think this precedent is critical, and we're on the verge of hitting that. And then in the background, you need to bring the infrastructure up with yourself, and having had the ability and the opportunity to build our own manufacturing facility. We just completed a sort of state-of-the-art, probably the most advanced facility of its kind in the world, 100,000 square foot factory right next to the International Airport in Sacramento, which we think can supply about a third of the existing patients in the US to start off with, and being able to treat all those patients out of a single location, all the patients in the continent, the US, out of a single location here in California, is also a really impressive point, and something that we're very excited about and proud of. And then just bringing in all the rest of the key folks that and sort of generating that culture of being extremely passionate and focused, because ultimately it's people who drive everything. I mean, I used to do some things myself back in the day, but now, unfortunately, I don't have much time to do things directly, and everything is done by the team. And without that team, we would be nowhere. And having the opportunity to build a really good team that's very passionate and focused on the main goal, and having that opportunity to focus on it, I think is also a huge achievement that I'm very proud of. So those are sort of some of the things. There's a lot more, but I think it's not often that you can go from a crazy idea on the bench to actually saving so many hundreds of lives. And having lived through that entire cycle is a very rare thing. And very few people are fortunate enough to go through that. And I am very grateful for having had that opportunity.
It's amazing to see the impact that you and the team have had, Ivan, and just so excited to follow you all along as you progress through the clinic and through the later stage ideas here. I wanted to ask you directly, as kind of as we're closing up here. I mean, thinking about patient impact and looking towards the future as a whole, with the adoption of Orca's platform and the scale up of precision allogeneic cell manufacturing, we'll hopefully see the cost barriers changing for cell therapy. And it's kind of great to see how you and the team have already started approaching this, already attacking this in the clinic right now, as far as y'all have come. But, as we're looking towards the future, and you see this from yourself and your perspective, Ivan, when do you kind of see this tipping point happening within cell therapy? Maybe if you wanted to project out in the future with us a little bit, would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Very tough.
It's a very tough question. And, when it comes to accessibility, there's, of course, multiple aspects that matter here. But one big thing is costs. And there have been actually studies specifically in the bone marrow transplant space that have outlined the cost of the system that these patients have. And it's pretty substantial. It's over $1 million per patient that the medical system is paying today for these diseases. And if you can improve the outcomes of these patients, in other words, the efficacy and the cure rates, but also the toxicity associated and the quality of life that these folks come out of at the end, you can substantially reduce a lot of the costs on the medical system. And so specifically in the areas that we're in, I think there's a big chance and a very rapid chance to make this accessible to folks pretty quickly.
Well, thank you, Ivan. If I could squeeze one more question in here, as we're talking about, I'm just infinitely curious on this side. As you were talking about, I mean, it's so as a pause with Orca, I mean, it's amazing to see, again, as we've talked about in this conversation, precision on one side and then manufacturing and scale on both of those. As a platform company, there's a lot to work up with there as you're growing. But as we kind of mentioned the ecosystem question around Ford, what they had to do, talking about, just learnings with history, right? I kind of wanted to bring in two other moguls for this question, right? Like Rockefeller and some of the other folks that have kind of worked around building out those new ecosystems. As you're talking about with any platform company, there's almost always a debate between vertical integration and horizontal platform expansion. How is Orca thinking about these opportunities?
That's a great question. That's a question that I've been struggling with from day zero. Like, there's so many things you can do, what do you do? And sometimes that can be a curse, right? Because if you can do so many things, it's very tempting to spread yourself thin. And if you spread yourself too thin, then self-destructs. So you have to be very careful. So you have to, like everything in life, you have to find the right balance. And I think for us, the right balance has been focus on a few key areas or a few key verticals. I think focusing only on one is too risky because you have all your eggs in that basket, and if it doesn't work out, you have no backup plan. So you need a backup plan, and maybe you need a second backup plan, but that's kind of it. Meaning focus on one or two, maybe three areas. Ideally, these areas are valuable enough such that if that's the only thing that succeeds, you've still made a very successful, very valuable company. So it's important to focus on important areas, not just any areas, but then focus on maybe two or three tops, because you do need to focus, because ultimately your platform will be validated by the success of the specific applications and areas that you're focusing on. So you need to make those successful. And for those to be successful, you need to put all of your resources there, because you barely have enough resources always. Resources are always limited. So you can't just like spread thin. But as long as you have one backup plan, you're pretty good. Maybe two, that's fine. But the fourth and fifth and sixth backup plan are not that useful at all. So focus on the main one that's just as valuable, hopefully. And in this way, you'll be in a good position because you're covered on most areas, and you're focused enough so you can really have an impact and demonstrate and create value. So yeah, that is a tough question, but it's a good question.
Tough question. It's amazing to see how you're wrestling it on your own perspective, and just so excited to see how Orca addresses some of these challenges. You're such a multifaceted company, and how you've approached bone marrow transplantation has honestly been fantastic, integrating just being a therapeutics company, but scale of a platform manufacturing, there's so much you have to change. And it's amazing to see at the later stages as Orca has been progressing, how you all have been addressing it. So kudos to you and the team on an amazing level. But to close us off, I'm just going to pass it over to Chris for a few rapid fire questions. So I'll let Chris take it away. Thanks again so much, Ivan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Ivan. As Drew said, a few rapid fire questions just to cap things off. I think first and foremost, we'd love to start with something you've already addressed, but even projected out further and say, let's imagine it's 2050. What are your thoughts? Where is the cell and gene therapy field going to be by that stage?
That is a great question. Again, I maybe have to fall onto a little bit more of the area that I do understand. So maybe you'll get a bit of a more biased answer. It's hard for me to know the entire field, at least intelligently to speak about the entire field. But in our area, what we're fundamentally focused on is giving folks new and healthy and powerful blood and immune systems. And I think maybe in 2050, we will understand the essence of how everything works in the body, or at least to a very large extent, that we might have very effective and efficient ways to control it and to rejigger it and make it extremely powerful and protective of all the diseases that we're sort of tackling. So maybe in 2050, we'll have exquisite science and understanding as a result of all of the cell and gene therapy approaches and therapeutics that we've generated and deployed that might be sort of a way for us to create these manipulations inside the body rather than outside the body, right? In the sense that right now we're taking all of these cells outside, we're manipulating them there, and we're putting them right in the body, or we're growing them and putting them in the body. But maybe if you understand how these cells work and why they function properly, maybe there's something that you can do instead of doing it outside the body, you could just do it directly inside the body. Maybe it's some kind of a signaling that you give them, or some kind of a way of changing their nature without having to remove them from outside, and ultimately generate the efficacy and the results that you need. So maybe in 50 years, we'll be doing similar manipulations or even more exquisite manipulations, but all sort of seamlessly without having to go through all this sophisticated manufacturing and complex outside the body stuff. Just have it all happen inside the body, and and therefore make it a lot more doable and at a much larger scale.
That's a phenomenal vision. And as we think about that timeline, where do you see Orca still there in 2050?
I'd like for us to be at the forefront, especially when it comes to at the forefront of sort of controlling that immune system and making it as curative as possible for you. And I'd like for us to, our vision as a company is to make this a general purpose tool for all of medicine, not just cancers, but every area in medicine that can benefit from a better blood and immune system. Of course, the next big one is autoimmune disorders, right? All these diseases where the immune system is essentially attacking your own body and creating a horrible disease and a horrible outcome. And if we could also help there and ultimately be a general purpose tool, bring this ability to doctors across all areas of medicine to control and reprogram people's immune systems to make them fight diseases better and to cure diseases, is really the vision that we're pursuing. And we hope we're at the forefront of that, implementing that vision. And we're impacting as many patients as possible. So hopefully by 2050, we're doing the same stuff, but with a lot more sophisticated tools.
Before we wrap up here, any other closing thoughts, shameless plugs, anything you'd like to share with our audience about the phenomenal work you and your team are pursuing?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything shameless. I think we're just super excited about just the outcomes with the patients and how amazing the transformation has been from being on death's door to having a very healthy life. And just seeing that over and over again is the thing that I just keep thinking it's unbelievable. And I just keep highlighting it over and over again. And that's the thing we're most proud of. So that's as shameless as it gets.
And thank you, Ivan, for an absolutely fantastic episode, sharing more about your background, the history of the space and Orca, and all the incredible work you've been able to do for patients in the field. Thank you to Drew for leading us through this. We're very grateful for your time.
Thank you guys also for setting this up, inviting us, and creating such a great community of folks, and really helping propagate a lot of the stories out there. I think some of these stories have been very inspirational for a lot of folks, including myself. So thank you for doing what you guys are doing as well.